Wrinkle in Time, Day 4. There wasn't a gust of wind, or there was a gust of wind, and a great thrust and a sharp shattering as she was shoved through what? Then darkness, silence, nothingness. If Calvin was still holding her hand, she could not feel it. By this time she was prepared for the sudden and complete dissolution of her body. When she felt the tingling coming back to her fingertips, she knew that this journey was almost over, and she could feel again the pressure of Calvin's hand about hers. Without warning, coming as a complete, unexpected shock, she felt a pressure she had never imagined, as though she were being completely flattened out by an enormous steamroller. This was far worse than the nothingness had been. While she was nothing, there was no need to breathe, but now her lungs were squeezed together, so that although she was dying for want of air, there was no way for her lungs to expand and contract, to take in the air that she must have to stay alive. This was completely different from the thinning of atmosphere when they flew up the mountain and she had to put the flowers to her face to breathe. She tried to gasp, but a paper doll can't gasp. She thought she was trying to think, but her flattened out mind was as unable to function as her lungs. Her thoughts were squashed along with the rest of her. Her heart tried to beat. It gave a knife-like sideways movement, but it could not expand. But then she seemed to hear a voice, or if not a voice, at least words flattened out by printed words on paper. Oh no, we can't stop here. This is a two-dimensional planet, and the children can't manage here. She was whizzed into nothingness again, and nothingness was wonderful. She did not mind that she could not feel Calvin's hand, that she could not see or feel or be. The relief from the intolerable pressure was all she needed. Then the tingling began to come back to her fingers, her toes. She could feel Calvin holding her tightly. Her heart was beating regularly. Blood coursed through her veins. Whatever had happened, whatever mistake had been made, it was over now. She thought she heard Charles Wallace saying, his words round and full as spoken words ought to be. Really, Mrs. Witch, you might have killed us. This time she was pushed out of the frightening fifth dimension with a sudden, immediate jerk. There she was, herself again, standing with Calvin beside her, holding on to her hand for dear life, and Charles Wallace in front of her, looking indignant. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch were not visible, but she knew that they were there. In fact, the fact of their presence was strong about her. Children, I apologize, came Mrs. Witch's voice. Now, Charles, calm down, Mrs. Whatsit said, appearing not as the great and beautiful beast she had been when they last saw her, but in her familiar wild garb of shawls and scarves and the old tramp's coat and hat. You know how difficult it is for her to materialize. If you are not substantial yourself, it's very difficult to realize how limiting protoplasm is. I am sorry, Mrs. Witch's voice came again, but there was more than a hint of amusement in it. It is not funny. Charles Wallace gave a childish stamp of his foot. Mrs. Who's glasses shone out, and the rest of her appeared more slowly behind them. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, she smiled broadly. Prospero in the Tempest. I do like that play. You didn't do it on purpose, Charles demanded. Oh, my darling, of course not, Mrs. Whatsit said. It was just a very understandable mistake. It's very difficult for Mrs. Witch to think in a corporal way. She wouldn't hurt you deliberately, you know that, and it's really a very pleasant little planet, and rather amusing to be flat. We always enjoy our visits there. Where are we now, then? Charles Wallace demanded, and why? In Orion's belt. We have a friend here, and we want you to have a look at your own planet. When are we going home? Meg asked anxiously. What about Mother? What about the twins? They'll be terribly worried about us when we didn't come in at bedtime. Well, Mother must be frantic by now. She and the twins and Fort will have been looking for us, and of course we're not there to be found. No, don't worry, my pet, Mrs. Whatsit said cheerfully. We took care of that before we left. Her mother has had enough to worry about her with you and Charles to cope with, and not knowing about your father without adding to her anxieties. We took a time wrinkle as well as a space wrinkle. It's very easy to do if you just know how. What do you mean? Meg asked plaintively. Please, Mrs. Whatsit, it's all so confusing. Just relax and don't worry over things that needn't trouble you, Mrs. Whatsit said. We made a nice, tidy little time tester, and unless something goes terribly wrong, we'll have you back about 5 minutes before you left. So there you'll be time to spare, and nobody will ever know you were gone at all. Though of course you'll be telling your mother, dear lamb, that she is. And if something goes terribly wrong, it won't matter whether we'll ever get back at all. Don't frighten them, Mrs. Witch's voice came. Are you losing faith? Oh, no. No, I'm not. But Meg thought her voice sounded a little faint. I hope this is a nice planet, Calvin said. We can't see much of it. Does it ever clear up? Meg looked around her, realizing that she had been so breathless from the journey and the stop on the two-dimensional planet that she had not noticed her surroundings. And perhaps this was not very surprising, for the main thing about the surroundings was exactly that. They were unnoticeable. They seemed to be standing on some kind of nondescript, flat surface. The air around them was gray. It was not exactly fog, but she could see nothing through it. Visibility was limited to the nicely definite bodies of Charles Wallace and Calvin, the rather unbelievable bodies of Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who, and a faint, occasional glimmer that was Mrs. Witch. Come, children, Mrs. Whatsit said. We don't have far to go, and we might as well walk. It will do you good to stretch your legs a little. As they moved through the grayness, Meg caught an occasional glimpse of slag-like rocks, but there were no traces of trees or bushes, nothing but flat ground under their feet, no sign of any vegetation at all. Finally, ahead of them, there loomed what seemed to be a hill of stone. As they approached it, Meg could see that there was an entrance that led into a deep, dark cavern. Are we going in there? She asked nervously. Don't be afraid, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's easier for the happy medium to work within. Oh, you'll like her, children. She's very jolly. If I ever saw her looking unhappy, I would be very depressed myself. As long as she can laugh, I'm sure everything is going to come out right in the end. Mrs. Whatsit, came Mrs. Witch's voice severely. Just because you are very young is no excuse for talking too much. Mrs. Whatsit looked hurt, but she subsided. Just how old are you? Calvin asked her. Just a moment, Mrs. Whatsit murmured, and appeared to calculate rapidly upon her fingers. She nodded triumphantly. Exactly 2,379,152,497 years, 8 months, and 3 days. That is according to your calendar, of course, which even you know isn't very accurate. She leaned closer to Meg and Calvin and whispered, It was really a very great honor for me to be chosen for this mission. It's just because of my verbalizing and materializing so well, you know. But of course, we can't take any credit for our talents. It's how we use them that counts. And I make far too many mistakes. That's why Mrs. Who and I enjoyed seeing Mrs. Witch make a mistake when she tried to land you on a two-dimensional planet. It was that we were laughing at, not at you. She was laughing at herself, you see. She's really terribly nice to us younger ones. Meg was listening with such interest to what Mrs. Whatsit was saying that she hardly noticed when they went into the cave. The transition from the grayness of the outside to the grayness of inside was almost unnoticeable. She saw a flickering light ahead of them, ahead and down, and it was towards this that they went. And they drew closer. She realized that it was a fire. It gets very cold in here, Mrs. Whatsit said, so we asked her to have a good bonfire going for you. As they approached the fire, they could see a dark shadow against it, and as they went closer still, they could see that the shadow was a woman. She wore a turban of beautiful pale mauve silk and a long, flowing purple satin gown. In her hands was a crystal ball into which she was gazing raptly. She did not appear to see the children, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch, but continued to stare into the crystal ball, and as she stared she began to laugh, and she laughed and laughed at whatever it was that she was seeing. Mrs. Witch's voice rang out clear and strong, echoing against the walls of the cavern, and the words fell with a sonorous clang. We are here. The woman looked up from the ball, and when she saw them, she got up and curtsied deeply. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who dropped their small curtsies in return, and the shimmer seemed to bow slightly. Oh, medium dear, Mrs. Whatsit said. These are the children, Charles Wallace Murray. Charles Wallace bowed. Margaret Murray. Meg felt that if Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who had curtsied, she ought to also, so she did, rather awkwardly. And Calvin O'Keefe. Calvin bowed his head. We want them to see their home planet, Mrs. Whatsit said. The medium lost the delighted smile she had worn till then. Oh, why must you make me look at unpleasant things when there are so many beautiful, delightful ones to see? Again Mrs. Witch's voice reverberated through the cave. There will no longer be so many pleasant things to look at if responsible people do not do something about the unpleasant ones. The medium sighed and held the ball high. "Look, children," Mrs. Whatsit said. "Look into it well. Que later est petit aquila de Leo. How small is the earth to him who looks from heaven." Mrs. Who intoned musically. Meg looked into the crystal ball, at first with caution, then with increasing eagerness, as she seemed to see an enormous sweep of dark and empty space, and then galaxies swinging across it. Finally, they seemed to move in closer on one of the galaxies. "You know the Milky Way," Mrs. Whatsit whispered to Meg. They were headed directly toward the center of the galaxy. When they moved off to one side, stars seemed to be rushing at them. Meg flung her arm up over her face as though to ward off the blow. "Look," Mrs. Witch commanded. Meg dropped her arm. They seemed to be moving in toward a planet. She thought she could make out polar ice caps. Everything seemed sparkling clear. No, medium dear. That's Mars," Mrs. Whatsit reproved gently. "Do I have to?" the medium asked. "Now," Mrs. Witch commanded. The bright planet moved out of their vision. For a moment there was the darkness of space, then another planet. The outlines of this planet were not clean and clear. It seemed to be covered with a smoky haze. Through the haze, Meg thought she could make out the familiar outlines of continents like pictures in her social studies books. "Is it because of our atmosphere that we can't see properly?" she asked anxiously. "No, Meg. You know that it is not the atmosphere," Mrs. Witch said. "You must be brave." "It's the thing," Charles Wallace cried. "It's the dark thing we saw from the mountain peak on Uriel when we were riding on Mrs. Whatsit's back." "Did it just come?" Meg asked in agony, unable to take her eyes from the thickness of the shadow which darkened the beauty of the earth. "Did it just come while we've been gone?" Mrs. Witch's voice seemed very tired. "Tell her," she said to Mrs. Whatsit. Mrs. Whatsit sighed. "No, Meg, it hasn't just come. It has been there for a great many years. That is why your planet is such a troubled one." "But why?" Calvin started to ask, his voice croaking hoarsely. Mrs. Whatsit raised her hand to silence him. "We showed you the dark thing on Uriel first. Oh, for many reasons. First, because the atmosphere on the mountain peaks there is so clear and thin you could see it for what it is. And we thought it would be easier for you to understand if you saw it, well, someplace else first, not your own Earth." "I hate it," Charles Wallace said passionately. "I hate the dark thing." Mrs. Whatsit nodded. "Yes, Charles, dear, we all do. That's another reason we wanted to prepare you on Uriel. We thought it would be too frightening for you to see it first of all about your own beloved world." "But what is it?" Calvin demanded. "We know that it's evil, but what is it?" "You have said it," Mrs. Witch's voice rang out. It is evil. It is the powers of darkness." "But what's going to happen?" Meg's voice trembled. "Oh, please, Mrs. Witch, tell us what's going to happen." "We will continue to fight." Something in Mrs. Witch's voice made all three of the children stand straighter, throwing back their shoulders with determination, looking at the glimmer that was Mrs. Witch with pride and confidence. "And we're not alone, you know, children," came Mrs. Whatsit to comfort her. "All through the universe it's being fought, all through the cosmos but it's a grand and exciting battle. I know it's hard for you to understand about size, how there's very little difference in the size of the tiniest microbe in the greatest galaxy. You think about that, and maybe it won't seem strange to you that some of our very best fighters have come right from your own planet. And it's a little planet, dears, out on the edge of a little galaxy. You can be proud that it's done so well." "Who have our fighters been?" Calvin asked. "Oh, you must know them, dear," Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who's spectacles shone out at them triumphantly. "And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." "Jesus," Charles Wallace said. "Why, of course, Jesus." "Of course," Mrs. Whatsit said. "Go on, Charles, love. There were others. All your great artists. They've been lights for us to see by." "Leonardo da Vinci," Calvin suggested tentatively, "and Michelangelo." "And Shakespeare," Charles Wallace called out, "and Bach, and Pasteur, and Madame Curie, and Einstein." Now Calvin's voice rang with confidence. "And Schweitzer, and Gandhi, and Buddha, and Beethoven, and Rembrandt, and St. Francis." "Now you, Meg," Mrs. Whatsit ordered. "Oh, Euclid, I suppose?" Meg was in such an agony of impatience that her voice grated irritably. "And Copernicus. But what about Father? Please, what about Father?" "We are going to your father," Mrs. Witch said. "But where is he?" Meg went over to Mrs. Witch and stamped as though she were as young as Charles Wallace. Mrs. Whatsit answered, in a voice that was low but quite firm. "On a planet that has given in, so you must prepare to be very strong." All traces of cheer had left the happy medium's face. She sat holding the great ball, looking down at the shadowed earth, and a slow tear coursed down her cheek. "I can't stand it any longer," she sobbed. "Watch now, children, watch." Chapter 6, The Happy Medium. Again they focused their eyes on the crystal ball. The earth, with its fearful covering of dark shadows, swam out of view, and they moved rapidly through the Milky Way, and there was the thing again. The darkness seemed to seethe and rise. Was this meant to comfort them? Suddenly there was a great burst of light through the darkness. The light spread out, and where it touched the darkness disappeared. The light spread until the patch of dark thing had vanished, and there was only a gentle shining, and through the shining came the stars, clear and pure. Then slowly the shining dwindled until it, too, was gone. There was nothing but stars and starlight, no shadows, no fear, only the stars and the clear darkness of space, quite different from the fearful darkness of the thing. "You see," the medium cried, smiling happily, "it can be overcome. It is being overcome all the time." Mrs. Whatsit sighed, a sigh so sad that Meg wanted to put her arms around her and comfort her. "Tell us exactly what happened, then, please," Charles Wallace said in a small voice. "It was a star," Mrs. Whatsit said sadly. "A star giving up its life in battle with the thing. It won. Oh, yes, my children, it won, but it lost its life in the winning." Mrs. Witch spoke again. Her voice sounded tired, and they knew that speaking was a tremendous effort for her. "It was not so long ago for you, was it?" she asked gently. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head. Charles Wallace went up to Mrs. Whatsit. "I see. Now I understand. You were a star once, weren't you?" Mrs. Whatsit covered her face with her hands, as though she were embarrassed, and nodded. "And you did? You did what that star just did?" With her face still covered, Mrs. Whatsit nodded again. Charles Wallace looked at her very solemnly. "I should like to kiss you." Mrs. Whatsit took her hands down from her face and pulled Charles Wallace to her in a quick embrace. He put his arms about her neck, pressed his cheek against hers, then kissed her. Meg felt that she would have liked to kiss Mrs. Whatsit too, but that, after Charles Wallace, anything that she or Calvin did or said would be anticlimax. She contented herself with looking at Mrs. Whatsit. Even though she was used to Mrs. Whatsit's odd get-up, and the very oddness of it was what made her seem so comforting. She realized with a fresh shock that it was not Mrs. Whatsit herself that she was seeing at all. The true Mrs. Whatsit, Meg realized, was beyond human understanding. What she saw was only the game Mrs. Whatsit was playing. It was an amusing and charming game, a game full of both laughter and comfort, but it was only the tiniest facet of all the things Mrs. Whatsit could be. "I didn't mean to tell you," Mrs. Whatsit faltered. "I didn't mean ever to let you know. But oh, my dears, I did so love being a star." "You are still very, very young," Mrs. Witch said, her voice faintly chiding. The medium sat looking happily at the star-filled sky and her ball, smiling and nodding and chuckling gently. But Meg noticed that her eyes were drooping, and suddenly her head fell forward, and she gave a faint snore. "Poor thing," Mrs. Whatsit said. "We've worn her out. It's very hard work for her." "Please, Mrs. Whatsit," Meg said, "what happens now? Why are we here? What do we do next? Where is Father? When are we going to him?" She clasped her hands pleadingly. "One thing at a time, love," Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who cut in. "As perdes tem avias." That's Portuguese. Walls have ears. "Yes, let's go outside," Mrs. Whatsit said. "Come, we'll let her sleep." But as they turned to go, the medium jerked her head up and smiled at them radiantly. "You weren't going to go without saying goodbye to me, were you?" she asked. "We thought we'd just let you sleep, dear." Mrs. Whatsit patted the medium's shoulder. "We worked you terribly hard, and we know you must be very tired. But I was going to give you some ambrosia, or nectar, or at least some tea." At this Meg realized that she was hungry. How much time had passed since they had had their bowls of stew, she wondered. But Mrs. Whatsit said, "Oh, thank you, dear, but I think we'd better be going." They don't need to eat, you know," Charles Wallace whispered to Meg. "At least not food, the way we do. Eating's just a game with them. As soon as we get organized again, I'd better remind them that they'll have to feed us sooner or later." The medium smiled and nodded. "It does seem as though I should be able to do something nice for you, after having had to show those poor children such horrid things. Would they like to see their mother before they go?" "Could we see Father?" Meg asked eagerly. "No," Mrs. Witch said. "We are going to your father, Meg. Do not be impatient. But she could see her mother, couldn't she? The medium wheeled. Oh, why not? Miss Whatsit put in. It won't take long, and it can't do any harm. And Calvin, too? Meg asked. Did he see his mother, too? Calvin touched Meg in a quick gesture, and whether it was of thanks or apprehension, she was not sure. I think it is a mistake, Miss Switch was disapproving. But since you have mentioned it, I suppose you must go ahead. I hate it when she gets cross, Miss Whatsit said, glancing over at Miss Switch. And the trouble is, she always seems to be right. But I really don't see how it could hurt, and it might make you all feel better. Go on, medium dear. The medium, smiling and humming softly, turned the crystal ball a little between her hands. Stars and comets, planets flashed across the sky, and then the earth came into view again, and the darkened earth closer, till it filled the globe, and they had somehow gone through the darkness until the soft white of clouds and the gentle outline of continents shone clearly. Calvin's mother first, Meg whispered to the medium. The globe became hazy, cloudy, then shadows began to solidify, to clarify, and they were looking into an untidy kitchen with a sink full of unwashed dishes. In front of the sink stood an unkempt woman with her gray hair stringing about her face. Her mouth was open, and Meg could see the toothless gums, and it seemed that she could almost hear her screaming at two small children who were standing by her. Then she grabbed a long wooden spoon from the sink and began whacking one of the children. Oh dear, the medium murmured, and the picture began to dissolve. I didn't really. It's all right, Calvin said in a low voice. I think I'd rather you knew. Now, instead of reaching out to Calvin for safety, Meg took his hand in hers, not saying anything in words, but trying to tell him by the pressure of her fingers what she felt. If anyone had told her only the day before that she, Meg, the snaggle-toothed, the myopic, the clumsy, would be taking a boy's hand to offer him comfort and strength, particularly a popular and important boy like Calvin, the idea would have been beyond her comprehension. But now it seemed as natural to want to help and protect Calvin as it did Charles Wallace. The shadows were swirling in the crystal again, and as they cleared, Meg began to recognize her mother's lab at home. Mrs. Murray was sitting perched on her high stool, writing away at a sheet of paper on a clipboard on her lap. She's writing Father, Meg thought, the way she always does, every night. The tears that she could never learn to control swam to her eyes as she watched. Mrs. Murray looked up from her letter, almost as though she were looking toward the children, and then her head drooped, and she put it down on the paper and sat there, huddled up, letting herself relax into an unhappiness that she never allowed her children to see. And now the desire for tears left Meg. The hot, protective anger she had felt for Calvin when she looked into his home, she now felt turned toward her mother. Let's go, she cried harshly. Let's do something. She's always so right, Mrs. Whatsit murmured, looking towards Miss Switch. Sometimes I wish she'd just say I told you so, and have done it. Yeah, and have done with it. I only meant to help, the medium wailed. Oh, medium dear, don't feel badly, Mrs. Whatsit said swiftly. Look at something cheerful. Do. I can't bear to have you distressed. It's all right, Meg assured the medium earnestly. Truly it is, Mrs. Medium, and we thank you very much. Are you sure? The medium asked, brightening. Of course, it really helped ever so much because it made me mad, and when I'm mad I don't have room to be scared. Well, kiss me goodbye for good luck then, the medium said. Meg went over to her and gave her a quick kiss, and so did Charles Wallace. The medium looked smilingly at Calvin and winked. I want the young man to kiss me too. I always did love red hair, and he'll give you good luck, laddie me love. Calvin bent down, blushing, and awkwardly kissed her cheek. The medium tweaked his nose. You've got a lot to learn, my boy, she told him. Now goodbye, medium dear, and many thanks, Mrs. Whatsit said. I dare say we'll see you in an eon or two. Where are you going in case I want to tune in? The medium asked. Camazotz, the Mrs. Whatsit told her. Where and what was Camazotz? Meg did not like the sound of the words, or the way in which Mrs. Whatsit pronounced it. But please don't distress yourself on our behalf. You know you don't like looking in on the dark planets, and it's very upsetting to us when you aren't happy. But I must know what happens to the children, the medium said. It's my worst trouble, getting fond. If I didn't get fond, I could be happy all the time. Oh, well, ho-hum, I manage to keep pretty jolly, and a little snooze will do wonders for me right now. Goodbye, everybody. And her word got lost in the general buzz of a snore. Come, Mrs. Witch ordered, and they followed her out of the darkness of the cave to the impersonal grayness of the medium's planet. Now, children, you must not be frightened at what is going to happen, Mrs. Witch warned. Stay angry, little Meg, Mrs. Whatsit whispered. You will need all your anger now. Without warning, Meg was swept into nothingness again. This time the nothingness was interrupted by a feeling of clammy coldness, such as she had never felt before. The coldness deepened and swirled about her and through her, and was filled with a new and strange kind of darkness. It was a completely tangible thing, a thing that wanted to eat and digest her, like some enormous malignant beast of prey. Then the darkness was gone. Had it been the shadow, the black thing? Had they had to travel through it to get to her father? There was the by now familiar tingling in her hands and feet, and the push through hardness, and she was on her feet, breathless but unharmed, standing beside Calvin and Charles Wallace. Is this Camazotz? Charles Wallace asked Mrs. Whatsit as Mrs. Whatsit materialized in front of him. Yes, she answered. Now let us just stand and get our breath and look around. They were standing on a hill, and Meg looked about her. She felt that it could easily be a hill on earth. There were the familiar trees she knew so well at home, birches, pines, maples, and though it was warmer than it had been when they so precipitously left the apple orchard, there was a faintly autumnal touch to the air. Near them were several small trees with reddened leaves, very like sumac, and a big patch of goldenrod-like flowers. As she looked down the hill, she could see the smokestacks of a town, and it might have been one of any number of familiar towns. There seemed to be nothing strange or different or frightening in the landscape. But Mrs. Whatsit came to her and put an arm around her comfortingly. I can't stay with you here, love, she said. You three children will be on your own. We will be near you. We will be watching you. But you will not be able to see us or ask us for help, and we will not be able to come to you. But is Father here? Meg asked, trembling. Yes. Well, where? When will we see him? She poised for running, as though she were going to sprint off immediately to wherever her father was. That I cannot tell you. You will have to wait until the propitious time. Charles Wallace looked steadily at Mrs. Whatsit. Are you afraid for us? A little. But if you weren't afraid to do what you did when you were a star, why should you be afraid for us now? But I was afraid, Mrs. Whatsit said gently. She looked steadily at each of the three children in turn. You will need help, she told them, but all I am allowed to give you is a little talisman. Calvin, your great gift is your ability to communicate with all kinds of people. So for you, I will strengthen this gift. Meg, I give you your faults. My faults? Meg cried. Your faults. But I'm always trying to get rid of my faults. Yes, Mrs. Whatsit said. However, I think you'll find they'll come in very handy on Camazotz. Charles Wallace, to you I can give only the resilience of your childhood. From somewhere Mrs. Who's glasses glimmered, and they heard her voice. Calvin, she said, a hint. For you, a hint. Listen. Well. For that he was a spirit too delicate to act their earthly and abhorred commands, refusing their grand hests, they did confine him, by help of their most potent ministers, and in their most unmitigable rage, into a cloven pine, within which rift imprisoned he painfully remained. Shakespeare, The Tempest. Where are you, Mrs. Who? Charles Wallace asked. Where's Mrs. Witch? We cannot come to you now. Mrs. Who's voice blew to them like the wind. Als Wind bin nicht dacht wer mir goeth. I do not know everything, still many things I understand. That is for you, Charles. Remember that you do not know everything. Then the voice was direct to Meg. To you I leave my glasses, a little blind as a bat, but do not use them except as a last resort. Save them for the final moment of peril. As she spoke, there was another shimmer of spectacles, and then it was gone, and the voice faded out with it. The spectacles were in Meg's hand. She put them carefully into the breast pocket of her blazer, and the knowledge that they were there somehow made her feel a little less afraid. To all three of you I give my command, Mrs. Witch said. Go down into the town. Go together. Do not let them separate you. Be strong. There was a flicker and then it vanished. Meg shivered. Mrs. Whatsit must have seen the shiver, for she patted Meg on the shoulder. Then she turned to Calvin. Take care of Meg. I can take care of Meg, Charles Wallace said, rather sharply. I always have. Mrs. Whatsit looked at Charles Wallace, and the creaky voice seemed somehow both to soften and to deepen at the same time. Charles Wallace, the danger here is greatest for you. Why? Because of what you are. Just exactly because of what you are, you will be by far the most vulnerable. You must stay with Meg and Calvin. You must not go off on your own. Beware of pride and arrogance, Charles, for they may betray you. At the tone of Mrs. Whatsit's voice, both warning and frightening, Meg shivered again, and Charles Wallace butted up against Mrs. Whatsit in the way he often did with his mother, whispering, Now I think I know what you meant about being afraid. Only a fool is not afraid, Mrs. Whatsit told him. Now go. And where she had been there was only sky and grasses and a small rock. Come on, Meg said impatiently. Come on, let's go. She was completely unaware that her voice was trembling like an aspen leaf. She took Charles Wallace and Calvin each by the hand and started down the hill.